Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out today on a gorgeous, gorgeous day, so you get extra points. It is weather that's long overdue. I've been complaining to the heavens about looking for weather like today, except for today when we have an event. So I'm Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. The McFarland Center sponsors lectures, conferences, special events, other programs that explore basic human questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. Today's talk is one of the Deichmann Family Lecture Series on religion and modernity, and I'm grateful to John Deichmann and his family for making events like this possible. You can always watch the past lectures or this one. Your friends who are outside in the hovel in the sun, you can tell them in a day or two that they want to watch this one online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, and just click on the Listen and Learn button. Today I'm really pleased to introduce writer, critic, and scholar Randy Boyagoda for a talk titled My Flannery Oconnor Problem and Yours, Being a Catholic Novelist in 2018. The fate of that strange and wondrous creature, the Catholic novelist, is actually something intriguing to me. Across the scope of the 20th century, and obviously before then, I can think of a great many English language Catholic writers, or particularly novelists. Chief among them, Flannery Oconnor, among my favorites, and their books have brought me joy, sometimes challenged me. In a fine 2013 article, the poet Dana Gioia, the former chair of the National Endowment of the Arts, wrote, simply stated, the paradox is that although Roman Catholicism constitutes the largest religious and cultural group in the United States, Catholicism currently enjoys almost no positive presence in the American fine arts. The situation not only represents a demographic paradox, it also marks an impoverishment, indeed a disfigurement, for Catholicism, which has for 2 millennia played a hugely formative and inspirational role in the arts. If we Americans have this problem, my answer, I decided, would be to invite a Canadian to help us think our way out of it. The principal and vice president of the University of St. Michael's College at the University of Toronto, Randy Boyagoda is also professor of English, holds the Basilian Chair in Christianity, Arts, and Letters, and teaches in the Christianity and Culture program. Professor Boyagoda is a Catholic novelist in 2018. His first novel, Governor of the Northern Province, published in 2006, imagines what would happen when an ex-African warlord shows up in the small town in Ontario, Canada. The book was a finalist for the Scotiabank Giller Prize. His second novel, Beggar's Feast, published in 2011, follows the transformed legacy of a man on an island over the course of the 20th century in what is today Sri Lanka. Beggar's Feast was a New York Times Editor's Choice selection and nominated for the 2012 Impact Dublin Literary Prize. You'll hear a preview today of his third novel, Original Prin, which will be published later this year. Professor Boyagoda is also author of a biography, Richard John Newhouse, A Life in the Public Square, and a scholarly monograph, Race, Immigration, and American Identity in the Fiction of Salman Rushdie, Ralph Ellison, and William Faulkner. You can see he keeps busy, published in 2007. He contributes essays, reviews, and opinions to publications including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, First Things, Harper's, Financial Times, Guardian, New Statesman, Globe and Mail, National Post, and appears frequently on CBC radio. I guess you don't appear on frequent CBC radio exactly, but whatever the right metaphor is. Before joining St. Mike's, Professor Boyagoda was a professor and chair of English at Ryerson University. He was also founding director of Zone Learning, a new university-wide experiential learning program which affords students the opportunity to pursue multidisciplinary projects with real-world impact. He also served as president of PEN Canada, the National Writers Organization that celebrates literature and defends freedom of expression at home and abroad. So that you found time to come here and be with us today, I'm grateful. And please welcome Randy Boyagoda.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thank you to Jonathan Mulrooney, my colleague from graduate school days. And let me say it's an honor to deliver one of the Deichmann Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity for the McFarland Center. I'm thinking about what you were saying there about all the many things. The one person that I think in all of this I should probably say thank you to, because I signed some agreement that this would be filmed and available online, is my mother. Because my wife's in California for work right now, and I'm here, and my mom's at home with our 4 daughters. So a shout out to my mom, and now there will be at least one YouTube view. We can guarantee that. Okay, So my talk is entitled My Flannery O'Connor Problem and Yours. What does it mean to be a Catholic novelist in 2018? My wife once suggested that I liked, quote, the idea of a big Catholic family. I should be more precise. She suggested this in the midst of a family stomach flu epidemic, while she was herself suffering from a cracked rib, which she developed after a bout of pneumonia that followed immediately after giving birth to our fourth child under the age of 6. Also, the toilet was leaking that night, and not in a good way. And I had a book review due the next morning and a lecture to give on campus, and as always, I was really hoping to find some time to get to work on my new novel. When my wife suggested I liked the idea of a big Catholic family, my hands were full of soiled sheets. Our household was loud with crying and rib-cracked coughing and desperate requests for ginger ale and iPads. If you're 6 years old and under, this combination is a cure-all, I add. And so I confess I do not recall what I said or did just then to inspire my wife to make the observation. She made it rather pointedly, in case you're wondering. Looking back, perhaps my poor memory is a small mercy for all concerned. But she was right. I do like the idea of a big Catholic family. I like this idea because it lets me prove something to my overwhelmingly secular and generally small-sized family, friends, and colleagues in the literary and academic worlds of New York and Toronto. This lets me bear witness to them. Lets me bear witness to them, not prove something. It lets me bear witness to the mutually encouraging nature of integrating one's vocation to a thriving and demanding family life, alongside a similarly intense creative and intellectual life, and professional and academic life, in ways beyond the restrictive and often binary terms set for us by our age. Now, that having been said, the opposite is the case when it comes to the idea of a Catholic writer. Over the years, I have not liked that idea at all. I do not want to bear witness, and I do not want to prove anything as a writer. Or, to be more precise, I do not want to bear witness given the politics of doing so these days within both the Catholic literary world and broader religious and trade publishing contexts. This long-standing position has a lot to do with Flannery O'Connor, and also, I think, with classic Catholic wedding gifts. You may have a sense of what I mean here, at least when it comes to the wedding gifts. Bulbous angel mugs, faux oil paintings of Jesus, biblical knickknacks carved by orphans in Bethlehem. My personal favorite was a massive bloody cross, crucifix, that one of my wife's sisters received from a fellow Midwesterner, or more precisely from her mother, because her daughter was marrying, a Mexican Catholic. In other words, Catholic as a marker of one's identity, affiliations, and commitments, whether as a newlywed or as a writer, generally carries with it a set of assumptions about one's style and sensibility that correlate with what people expect of you and presume for you. And in contemporary literary terms, in an American context, these assumptions and expectations have much to do with one figure in particular, a Georgia-born author who wrote strange and violent and strangely, violently funny short stories shot through with religious feeling. And now, friends, let me tell you a little about my Flannery O'Connor problem and yours. A few years ago, I wrote an essay for First Things magazine that began, "I'm sick of Flannery O'Connor." In the 16 years that I've been writing for audiences beyond myself and my mother, whenever she went through my drawers in search of autobiographical breakup poetry, those 5 words have proportionally generated more of a response than anything else I've written, whether novels, short fiction, a biography, academic articles, hundreds upon hundreds of pieces of literary and cultural criticism, many first publications with far greater circulation than First Things. This outsized reaction owes, I suspect, to the seeming act of Catholic literary blasphemy I'd committed in expressing frustration about O'Connor's distinctive, even singular reputation in both religious and secular contexts today. With all due respect to Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh, I can think of no Catholic writer with as secure a position in the modern canon who simultaneously enjoys continued admiration and popularity with self-consciously religious readers and writers. Her stories feature in scholarly publishing and conferences and show up on standard campus reading lists according to any number of literary, historical, and political rationales, irrespective of what secular-minded professors might think of her religious beliefs. Just as her continued prominence in religiously serious academic and literary contexts proceeds at pace of irrespective of how she's being read and taught in more exclusively, presumptively mundane settings. For all concerned, in sum, Flannery O'Connor is an eminently respectable writer to read, invoke, write about, and admire. The division I've just described is not nearly as sharp as it was, say, in 2000, when one book reviewer could, with caustic confidence, dismiss people who took O'Connor's faith seriously as more or less acolytes devoted to advancing the cult of, quote, Saint Flannery, myopically, devotionally, simplistically focused on her religion to the disproportionate exclusion of the other important elements that informed her life and work, specifically her life as a woman in post-war Georgia. In recent years, however, scholars like Farrell O'Gorman and Mark Grief have advanced readings of O'Connor's work that make a case for the mutual significance of her religious commitments and secular situating. Meanwhile, if in language I find too clinical, the great short story writer George Saunders has acknowledged, for instance, that there is, quote, a level of extra rationality in her work that non-religious readers at least must recognize, if not reckon with, if they want to appreciate the fullness of her literary glories. O'Gorman and Grief's work participates in what many now describe as the, quote, religious turn in the humanities that has emerged in recent years. This turn has been primarily encouraged, I think, by the ongoing impact of Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, and by various affirmations of his primary claim that we can all point to, I think, in both private life and in current affairs and geopolitics today. Taylor's primary claim, I'm sure familiar to many of you, is that the rise of modernity has not occasioned a simultaneous and proportionate decrease in religious practice and sensibility, only a greater fracturing and individualization of their justifications, leading it to a contested struggle over their fruitful versus destructive effects. Now, to contemplate and explore as much, Taylor himself encourages us to read literature. Guess which writer he points to? Me, actually. No, Flannery O'Connor. Meanwhile, within the non-academic world of Catholic arts, letters, culture, ideas, and ordinary lay and clerical life, O'Connor enjoys signal appeal. She is the one major modern literary writer that a Catholic intellectual, lawyer, business person, nun, or priest, or even non-English undergraduate at Holy Cross, I'll predict, has likely read. I claim this with supremely autobiographical confidence because she comes up every time I tell a Catholic that I'm a writer. It can sometimes feel a little like what happens a lot these days when a coworker, neighbor, or friend learns that you're a practicing Catholic. Oh yeah, goes the response. I love Pope Francis. What I've heard many times when I tell people that I'm a practicing Catholic writer is, oh yeah, I love Flannery O'Connor. And so a few years ago, I became frustrated with that and wrote that article for First Things magazine. It was a frustration that came out of the fact that O'Connor basically defines too much of what it means to be a Catholic writer today. Is your fiction violent and sort of funny, and does it involve God in some weird way? Then great, it's like a Flannery O'Connor story. What more needs to be said? But wait, you say, I needn't feel so yoked to Flannery O'Connor's wagon. After all, there is a prominent, religiously serious writer working in America today, and she certainly doesn't sound anything like Flannery O'Connor. Indeed, Marilynne Robinson is the only major novelist alive today capable of making widely read observations like, quote, I was slow in arriving at Christology, and, quote, I have been reading a lot of Jonathan Edwards lately, and I am really a Calvinist, and I believe in a divine creation and in the incarnation, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the life to come. And for saying all of this, Robinson rightly enjoys Pulitzer Prizes and both high critical and broad popular acclaim. For writers, critics, and scholars invested in a negative-minded, even defeatist and fatalistic narrative about the place and prominence of religiously serious literature in contemporary America, people to a degree like Dana Gioia, let's say, the success of Marilynne Robinson, the great Calvinist American novelist, makes no sense. A writer with Robinson's openly Christian beliefs should be bringing out her work with small, independent religious publishers, not winning Pulitzers and publishing interviews with the President of the United States in the New York Review of Books. I here refer to her conversation with a prior American president. That Robinson enjoys such a commanding position in America today, however, suggests the distinctive insights that can come from a religiously informed literary sensibility, and it's not captive to self-righteousness or self-embarrassment. Robinson's own fiction absolutely embodies as much. Her latest novel, Lila, might be the most theologically serious major American novel in recent memory, or at least the most theologically serious major American novel to appear since Robinson's last novel, Home, and before that, Gilead. Indeed, more contemporary-minded, religiously serious readers and writers can put aside O'Connor and take up Marilynne Robinson. She is an obvious exemplar for us. too obvious, dangerously obvious, in fact, because her work concerns the lives and times of two plain-spoken Protestant ministers and their families living in mid-20th century Iowa, and where they are profoundly convicted in their efforts to live a life for God amidst the records of fallen and broken lives, and also amidst the simple splendors of historical, rural American landscapes. As such, Robinson offers a rare source of sophisticated solace for 20th century bookish believers, while also offering an imposing standard for fellow religiously minded literary writers. As for everyone else, including more standard issue secular critics and readers, I can't help but wonder if they too are touched beyond mere appreciation and enjoyment by Robinson's writing. If they also can find in Robinson's pages a startling sense that, quote, there is more life in us than we can bear, and that this fullness finds its source and summit in God himself. A few years ago, I was at a dinner party with a group of fellow writers I've known for many years, all of whom are self-consciously secular progressives. Marilynne Robinson's work came up alongside Jonathan Franzen's, the author of The Corrections, among other novels. Now, while I personally contain multitudes and find much to enjoy in both of their bodies of writing, the consensus amongst my fellow writers was that they much preferred reading Marilynne Robinson over Jonathan Franzen. Why? I asked, knowing that all of them would be far more sympathetic ideologically to Franzen's worldview. After a reflective pause, one of them observed, she loves her characters. She writes out of love for her characters. Immediately, St. Augustine came to mind. His argument that the first and final purpose of literature, for both writer and reader, is to increase charity. And so, in the mission territory of a Toronto literary dinner party, here's this Calvinist American writer advancing the Augustinian vision of literature like no other novelist today. And so why then, beyond seething, self-flagellating envy, am I suggesting to you today that a signal challenge for a contemporary writer who shares Robinson's commitment to a religiously informed and ordered vision of human experience is, let's say, to try to say God without sounding like her? It's because Robinson makes it so damn easy for her readers to say God. Because hers is finally a God of 1950s rural red state life. The God of Robinson's fiction exists and exerts influence at a profound and, I think, neutralizing distance from our here and now. Of course, the questions and struggles of her characters often reach well beyond the particular moment into what Faulkner called the eternal verities of human experience, but the related discernments and discoveries of place and purpose within a coherent and legible divine plan say little, I think, to a readership like us, a readership largely defined by the flux and fluidity of our present moment, technologically saturated, culturally fragmented, economically stratified, and politically and religiously divided. Robinson's novels take us to a comparatively simpler, stable time and place, where they console us with struggles that are difficult but resolvable, identifiable but not implicating. We can close a Marilynne Robinson novel feeling deeply satisfied and feeling deeply wistful. If only mine were the spiritual struggles of a friendly old Iowa preacher from the 1950s. From the vantage of a conventional contemporary reader of serious fiction, religious experience in Robinson's novels has a lot in common, I think, with the religious experience to be found in contemporary post-colonial and indigenous writing, whether the source of faith in those instances is Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, or Aboriginal spirituality. In every case, religious experience can be received sincerely by the standard secular reader because among the great majority of these readers, they don't take this religion seriously. Robinson, in other words, is a quietly exotic writer, and I think some portion of her appeal rests in that. Now let's be clear. Marilynne Robinson should not be indicted for choosing to write fiction set in a time and world where religious belief was far more acceptable, never mind for doing it so brilliantly. My complaint is that her fiction only inspires but does not challenge those readers of hers who may broadly share her formation in a Judeo-Christian culture without personally subscribing these days to any particular instance of it, because it's basically historically closed off and even exotic. Again, it's not Robinson's responsibility to ensure her readers have such reckonings, but I'm confident she'd be open to as much, if not out of any evangelical spirit, then certainly because, like any writer, Marilynne Robinson seeks readers open to the fullest meanings of her work, which in Robinson's case are not finally brilliantly literary, but self-consciously and intentionally theological. Meanwhile, the commanding, popular, and idiosyncratic nature of her reputation as a religiously serious writer poses instead a challenge for other writers who seek to explore religious experience in their work if they choose not to write the same kind of stuff. but instead with imaginations and intentions more intent in figuring out how to say God in the here and now. A here and now, I remind you, that is technologically saturated and culturally fragmented, economically stratified and politically and religiously divided. To my mind, that's the reality that a religiously serious, indeed any Catholic writer should engage in their work today. Now, I remind you that my wife once accused me of liking the idea of a big Catholic family over and against much of its reality. Now, let me suggest to you why I gladly accept the reality of being a Catholic writer over and against the idea of it. That reality, I propose, involves an intentional integration and right ordering of one's creative vocation as a writer to one's greater vocation to faith and family life, to the church and to community. A Catholic writer should never have a room of one's own, I propose, for the necessarily individualized nature of the writing life is only justifiable for a consciously Catholic writer to the degree that that work creates and speaks to and about and for and sometimes against the surrounding culture and age. In any and all cases, the Catholic writer is called to contribute to the renewed revelation of the human person's inherent dignity and imperfect complexity, and likewise called to deepen and make new our capacity for wonder and awe at the source and summit of that dignity and complexity, which is to say, to bring us closer to discerning in human life and human works the tracery of God's supreme gift to us all. Or not. If I were to have to read that formulation instead of writing it, I might argue that there's nothing particularly Catholic about it, and that, again, at a neutralized historical remove, Marilynne Robinson offers as much in her fiction. Or I would simply subject these formulations to the supreme litmus test for all contentions about Catholic writing today. Does this accurately describe Flannery O'Connor's good country people? Whether the answer is yes or no, I bring tidings of great joy to Worcester today. I have stopped worrying about my Flannery O'Connor problem and yours. In fact, O'Connor's legacy is the good cross I have found, and that I have found as a Catholic writer. It's because I've come to a new sense of her work and of contemporary Catholic fiction's relationship to her and her work, thanks to a work I mentioned earlier, Mark Grief's The Age of Crisis of Man, Thought and Fiction in America, 1933 to 1973. I offer the full double-barreled title to convey a sense of the book's double-barreled concern in both ideas and their playing out in the novels and stories of a series of mid-century American writers, including Saul Bellow, Ralph Ellison, Thomas Pynchon, and yes, Flannery O'Connor. In writing about their work together, Grief offers, quote, a new philosophical history of mid-century that explores the, quote, rise of crisis of man discourse in American intellectual, literary, and broader public life from the 1930s onward to the early 1970s. His interest is in exploring the ways in which these writers took up abstract and universalizing concepts of the good and of human identity, dignity, purpose, and flourishing, all of which gained in prominence and currency in the United States during this period in direct response to the rise of fascist and communist totalitarianisms. Only as much as the writer's Grief considers had little sympathy, were indeed variously against fascism and communism, this does not mean they straightforwardly or uncritically applied the idealizing tenets of modern American progressivism in their fiction. Rather, Grief observes, quote, since the fiction writer's answers had to take stock of truths of American life that the abstract discourse did not, life as a Jew or as an African American, life with an orthodox religious belief or hemmed in by pervasive technology, their accounts frequently undid the hopes of the original questions of man, focused on answers that could be universalized beyond race and creed, precisely on matters of difference. Grief's ensuing chapters more or less establish and develop the governing irony in supple prose that O'Connor matters because of her religious seriousness, that she engaged the world around her as a Catholic, and that is what made her work have a certain purchase in mid-century life in ways that many others did not. Now, I do think Grief's reading of O'Connor is excellent, and I prefer his putting O'Connor alongside Bellow and Ellison and Pynchon over, let's say, putting her alongside Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and Walker Percy, as per my friend and colleague Paul Ely's The Life You Say May Be Your Own, which is a very engaging and highly circumscribed and idiosyncratic study of four major American Catholic writers of the prior century. But my point in all of this is that O'Connor is not an important writer because she's Catholic, any more than Bellow was important because he was a Jew, Ellison because he was black, or Pynchon because he was once on The Simpsons. That's the only biographical information I have on Thomas Pynchon. Instead, Grief, who has no confessional relation to O'Connor from what I can tell, makes the case that it was irreducibly because of her Catholicism that O'Connor was able to differentiate herself from mid-century WASP intellectual cultural consensus, and out of that write provocative stories that efficiently and wickedly satirized a society and culture comfortably moving away from a binding relationship to traditional religious reference. Now, why, you may be asking, does this particular rendering of O'Connor's work allay my fears of being associated with her? It has much, probably too much, to do with the respectability and relevance she has been given afresh in being taken seriously on combined sacred and secular terms by the likes of Mark Grief. He is a founder of N+1, which I would argue is probably the most vital and serious literary intellectual magazine on the American scene today. He has, through that venue and other writings, emerged as a leading arbiter of what matters in elite literary culture and intellectually and culturally speaking in our broader society. With his new book, he has dispassionately pointed to a Catholic short story writer as an exemplar of what it means to tell stories replete with moral meaning and critical purchase. And so now I'm over my Flannery O'Connor problem and yours. In fact, I'm happy to love Flannery O'Connor and the idea of a Catholic writer, provided the terms of my love correspond to Grief's. Forgive this various and horribly mixed metaphor, but Grief has turned O'Connor into the literary equivalent of lace curtain Irish, and now that she has been legitimated on these terms, I want to be a literary lace curtain Sri Lankan. My willingness to be associated with O'Connor on these terms is obviously less than pure, and this impure desire speaks more generally to my own work as a novelist, and particularly to the novel that will be published in Canada this fall and in the United States in the spring. With this novel, I'm trying to make sense of human experience from a perspective I imagine I share with some people in this room, believers living in the here and now, who want to write and read about characters living in this same here and now, and who also believe. Having explored religious experience in various ways, African, Sri Lankan, Buddhist, exculpatory for writer and reader alike in my first two novels, I have decided to explore religious experience square on in my new novel, which is, again, YouTube, openly semi-autobiographical. The novel, original Prin, concerns a 40-year-old English professor and cradle Catholic living in present downtown Toronto. He's been diagnosed with prostate cancer. That is not autobiographical. Following treatment, Prin has to decide how best to live out the fullness of the life he's been granted by God. This is a decision made fraught by learning that his failing Catholic university in downtown Toronto is going to shut down unless it opens a satellite campus in a Middle East country just emerging from a civil war. He leaves behind his wife and children to go to the Middle East to help open this satellite campus in the company, by awkward coincidence, of his alluring ex-girlfriend from graduate school. While there, avoiding temptations and risking his life and convinced he's at last doing God's will, the hero meets an angry young Muslim man from Boston who has also come to the Middle East to risk his life to do God's will. The two of them meet in the middle of a terrorist attack where their very different understandings of God's will and personal sacrifice clash. In the segment that I'm going to read to you today, and that'll be how I close my talk, and I'm happy to have a conversation, Prin is visiting an ancient Christian church in this Middle Eastern country. The night before, he'd had an encounter with his ex-girlfriend that leaves him feeling very guilty. But you'd have to read to find out why. So this is from my forthcoming novel, Original Prin. Two hours after leaving the government complex, Prin and his driver, a new one, had made it out of the old city and onto the blunt, bland road that ran to the airport. They exited at a juncture between the blast walls that Prin hadn't noticed on his way into the old city. They went through set after set of security checkpoints until they were cleared to proceed along a thin, dusty road towards a large, orangey-looking mountain, all hard and jagged-edged. There were no green daubs of trees or peaky snowcaps or even clouds floating by. This was all and only mountain. "First time to see Kanisat al-Himar al-Mukharis," the driver said. "Is that the name of the place we're going?" asked Prin. "Is what we call it here," said the driver. "And what's the translation into English?" asked Prin. "Hard to put in English," said the driver. "Give it a try," said Prin. "Okay, my English is not so good when it's not stuff about driving, okay? But Kanisat al-Himar al-Mukharis, I think it would be something like the Church of the Holy Ass," said the driver. "Oh, okay, so how did this figure in the crucifixion? Do you know? Perhaps it's named for the donkey that brought Christ into Jerusalem for Passover?" asked Prin. He'd been told before that this church figured somehow in the crucifixion. Yes, okay, said the driver. Very holy place for Christians. Tremendously holy, as you Americans say. But not donkey. You know, I mean, I'm sure there's something a little lost in the translation. Also, I'm Canadian, said Prin. Okay, said the driver. They didn't speak for the rest of the trip. Theirs was the only vehicle going into the site. Now and then a tour bus or shuttle came at them from the opposite side, and each driver would pull halfway onto the sand-colored gravel shoulder so both could pass at the same time, waving. On either side of this narrow road all was rubble and flatness, broken up here and there by clumps of yellow-green shrub and metal box houses and spindly goats. There was laundry, bedsheets, tunics, tablecloths. He could even make out the smudge marks of last night's fires in a few places. He saw no people at all. Were they all at work? Or were they also hiding? From what? At the foot of the mountain, the van came under sudden shade and they turned off into a parking area half full of other vans. Prin's driver made it clear he was going to sit on a bench under a clump of mopey midget palm trees and play games on his phone until Prin returned from the chapel. And so Prin walked ahead, alone, breaching a biblical mountain. Here sun and shadow were at odds in close quarters. The sun lit up long, jagged ruts and cuts, runnels that had gone dry alongside the mountain. A few hundred paces away, and more in shadow than sun, sat a small, squat church, carved into the mountain base where the cleft closed. Its facade was a mishmash of bas-relief eastern domes and classical columns beneath a cross that looked like two big dry biscuits laid upon one another at 90 degrees. Prin pinched his phone screen to get an extreme close-up of the cross. "Stop!" said a man. Not a man, a monk. He was big and broad and dressed in black and wore a hammer-thick silver cross under his big bird's nest of a beard. He was standing just ahead, arms crossed, beside where the line to get into the church began. God's very own bouncer. The monk pointed to a sign nailed into the rock behind him. "We must preserve the holiness of this site. No pictures," it read in various languages. He then jerked his thumb to the side to a gift stall staffed by two vacant-faced women in black kerchiefs. "Buy pictures there when you leave," he said. "No," said another monk, who emerged from the other side of the line. He was as barreled and grim-faced and nest-bearded, only he wore a heavy silver cross on a jute-colored cassock. "Buy pictures there when you leave," he said. He pointed to another little gift stall just up from the first one. It was staffed by two vacant-faced women wearing jute-colored kerchiefs. Prin nodded at both monks, who were now glaring at each other, and slipped his phone into his pocket. He walked on, joining other pilgrims lined up to enter the chapel. Directly in front of him was a large group of Africans, all of whom were dressed in bright blue jumpsuits and carrying white umbrellas. Two turned, smiled, and nodded at him, sweat beating down their faces. They leaned in, and Prin smelled floral cologne and Lux soap. They wore name tags that read, "I'm Blessed Bruce," and "I'm Blessed Roy." "Hello," Prin said. "Blessed!" "And blessings to you," said Bruce. "Blessed!" "And blessings to you," said Roy. "Thank you," said Prin. "Is this your first time visiting the Holy Church?" "I'm Blessed Bruce" asked him. "Yes. Can you explain why the church is called, according to my driver's English, "Hello, boss! You have questions." "You would definitely like a tour guide. I spent a day with Harrison Ford when they filmed an Indiana Jones here. Han Solo! You would like to skip the line? Don't worry, I'm government certified and I can arrange everything totally for free. No cost at all. Guaranteed, 110%. I just want to practice my English. Come with me. Are you from England? Manchester, you. Princess Kate. Princess Megan. A loud, small, smiling man had appeared out of nowhere. He was bony and a little gristly, his clothes old and threadbare. His sandals were mere notions of footwear. He wore a lot of lanyards, all of which appeared to hold formal credentials of one kind or another. "Can you tell me why this church has this name?" Prin asked. "Of course, I can explain everything," the guide said. He took Prin's wrist very gently. Then he closed his grip and pulled. The Africans watched, smiling beatifically, nodding along with the conversation. "Please, come with me," the guide said. "Blessings to you and you," Prin said. The Africans stopped smiling. When Prin stepped out of line and passed them and the rest of their group, the guide leading the way in a righteous and barking manner as if he were trying to get Princess Diana past all the photographers to her car. But when they emerged near the front of the line, he didn't take Prin directly into the church. Instead, he took him to the furthest giant stone door from the small dark entrance. He did a thing with his neck, cleared his throat, and began. "Welcome to the Church of the Holy Seat, which is one of the most important historical sites in all of the world and a source of greatest national pride in Dragomans, regardless of your race, religion, or sexual orientations, except North Korea. As to why this church is of greatest significance, there are several reasons, some dating back centuries and even Millennium Falcon. Sorry, Star Wars joke. I made it with Harrison Ford and he loved it. Now, to begin our exploration, I would like to read the following statement by our president regarding the importance of preserving our innovative heritage. He declares, sorry, I have to catch a flight. Is there a pamphlet or something that I can look at? And can we go in now? Prin said. The guide nodded. Why wouldn't anyone let him give his speech? His wife and mother thought it was excellent. At least his mother did. Of course we can still go in, but please understand, with a wife and children to support and also a mother, if I can't practice my English on you, there's need for a small fee for me to arrange everything, said the guide. What if I don't pay? Asked Prin. No problem, boss. Nice to meet you. Enjoy your visit to the church and the rest of your time here in beautiful Dragomans. Like us on the Facebook. And please tell all your friends in English to visit Dragomans. Now, sir, please be pleased to return to the line. And I am required to call the brother over there if you don't respect the rules. He shrugged and grandly bowed and extended his arm to show Prin the way back. Prin looked at the beefy monk with his crossed arms and didn't want him called over. He looked at the line. The Africans hadn't moved yet, and another tour group had arrived. They were sullen white people, glowering men in denim and fanny packs, and pouty women with shotgun makeup faces and black rocker booties and matching purses with lots of gold crosses and dingles dangling from them. They were either Russian or Polish. He looked down. He saw a rock move. It was a baby lizard, round and colored like a rock. He moved his toe towards it, and it was gone. How much? Prin asked. Please, I can't say. This is not our way here. Whatever you can offer, I will gladly accept, and then I will arrange everything, the guide said. Prin took out his wallet. My wife just had a baby. Jaundice, the tour guide said. Prin gave him a $20 bill and didn't wince, not particularly, when the tour guide looked totally shocked. He beamed to himself and then at Prin before running off to the gift stalls and returning with 2 poorly photocopied pamphlets. They were histories of the church, exact copies of each other, with certain words underlined or crossed out in one, and the opposite set underlined and crossed out in the other. And now, distinguished honored guest, welcome to the Church of the Holy Seat, the guide said. Perhaps Prin had been mishearing the entire time. If this was the Church of the Holy See, then did it have something special, some papal significance related to St. Peter? Or perhaps it was a holy see. Somewhere else Christ had walked on water, in one of the apocryphal Gospels. Holding the pamphlets, Prin followed the guide inside. He felt a little like a running back moving behind a blocker as the guide pushed through the people colliding everywhere in the back of the church. Eventually, they were organized into 2 sort of lineups to approach the holy site located behind the main altar. According to 2 millennia of pious tradition, the church was founded on the site where a young man who had been a follower of Jesus came after escaping the Garden of Gethsemane during Christ's arrest. As the Gospel of Mark recounted, the young man left the garden so fast he dropped his loincloth, which was all that he was wearing. According to pious tradition, naked the young man ran and ran and ran out of Jerusalem and across Egypt, across the desert of Lehabim, and finally into Dragomans. Naked and terrified, he finally reached a cleft in a great mountain, where he found a rock ledge, sat down, and wept. He wept knowing he had abandoned his Lord in his time of trial, and knowing what had happened to Christ while he ran away, knowing what God had allowed to happen to his only Son for the sake of all weeping, fleeing, terrified humanity. And according to pious tradition, this nameless and naked young man wept so much the rock ledge beneath him softened from all of his tears and took on the shape of his seated buttocks, which remained there until his death. 4 centuries later, all that remained of this young man was a mound of gray dust resting upon the ledge in the cleft of the mountain. Now one day, 2 men who were part of a new order of desert monks happened to be traveling through these mountains seeking a spot for their monastery, and they planned to found together. They came to this cleft, and one of them, as to which one the pamphlets emphatically differed, swept this gray dust off the ledge before sitting down to rest and see whether from this ledge he could observe the greatness of God and contemplate it for the rest of his days. Upon sweeping away the dust and sitting down, the monk discovered the holy seat, imprinted with the mark of the naked young man of Mark's gospel, buttocks, who had fled from his Lord's side and wept unto his own death, having abandoned his God and feeling terrified that his God would abandon him. But God did not. God led this pious monk, again as to which one the pamphlets emphatically differed, to the place where the naked young man had stopped running and sat down. This guy's buttocks in parentheses. You read it differently than you read it out loud. And because both monks claimed for the rest of their lives to have been the first to have swept away the dust and discovered the imprint of the holy seat and sat there, and because each likewise claimed to have recovered all the young men's ashes and kept them in a sacred urn, 2 rival orders of monks were founded that day. And for 16 centuries since, these orders had shared custody of the church built around the holy seat. It was a small, dark place, and the air was close with many bodies and drying, dying flowers and guttering candles. What natural light there was came in through a series of bar-shaped openings cut into the main facade of the church. These threw just enough light down onto the floor to reveal a blue-white spread of mosaic tiles that occupied the center of the church's floor at the beginning of the nave. Many tiles were missing. All were faded. But Prin could still make out the image of a naked young man artfully concealed, his head down, one hand resting upon his brow as he sat and sobbed. Very few people were actually praying before the altar on the 2 or 3 little benches set up there. Instead, everyone was lined up along the aisles, waiting for their chance to venerate the holy seat, and in the meantime leaving flowers and lighting candles at all the little apse shrines available to them along the way. But now that he was in a church and could at last kneel down, Prin didn't know what to pray for. He thought again of all those little metal houses he'd seen on the chapel. Where were those people? Were they hiding? Were they running away? There were so many such people now, then, always, including Prin, including the naked young man of the gospel. But some didn't hide or run away. A little Spanish girl singing the Magnificat before the conquering Moors. As a boy, Prin had read about her in a comic book saint's life. Did she really keep singing after they chopped her head off? Until her voice was muffled by the great beating of pure white doves escaping from her open neck? There were so many such saints' lives, crazy holy men and women, boiled and split and scalped, left to broil in the belly of a giant metal pagan pig god, and hammered against this spiked wall, dragged upon the floor of that lion-filled chamber. And in and through it all, the saints are still singing, never denying, always praising God. A chord pulled and began trilling in an arc that ran from his heart to his mind. He strained his ears in vain to hear a matching voice, but he didn't. Prin wanted to throw himself against, I lost my spot. In the very place where Prin now was, as he just saw before he passed behind the altar to the side of the holy seat itself, there hung a simple bronze chain that came down and down and down from the center point of a cracked, vaulted ceiling. The chain held an iron mesh basket in which sat a small red amber globe, in which sat a thick, round candle. And yes, it was flickering. The candle was always flickering, whether in the suburban church of his childhood or now here in Dragoman's. Because this red amber globe, every such globe, hung before small stone vaults set in altars inlaid with old flaking gold everywhere. And in all these vaults, in this vault before him, there was a simple golden chalice within which rested the thin encircled body of Christ. Rests. But then the trilling cord went slack. He could have had such fullness down the street from his house, with his wife and children. Why did it have to be here, like this, after last night? Prin wanted to throw himself against it. The night before, he had betrayed Molly and the girls and another. You brought me here, God, for this, to betray them, to betray what you want of me, for me? What kind of God? No God would. No God. No. No? No. There was still no denying. The stars above were smudged, but they remained. Prin still wanted to be shattered, warmed, found, kept, filled, spared, caught and released, explicated, expiated, saved and sent home. He wanted to go home. He dropped down upon the cracked mosaic floor, closing his eyes to say something. Anything, to ask for something, anything, to hear something, anything. Did he? Was it? Was it yes? That he felt God pulling him here and not for him, not only for him, but for all of these other people, for Molly and the girls, and even, yes, but then the guide, who was hopeful of getting a second $20 bill on the way out, grabbed him under the armpits and heaved him up so that he could get to the front of the line. He was, in fact, second in line on the black robe side. On the other was a matching line controlled by the jute monks. The area itself, which was located in a large apse behind the main altar, was very tight. The ceiling sloped down dramatically, and the air was thick and shared by all the people crammed in there along the ambulatory, waiting their turn to venerate the holy seat. The arrangement, going back centuries, was for the two orders to alternate visitors approaching the holy seat itself, one at a time. In the meantime, those closest to the front of each line could contemplate flanking smaller shrines, each of which held, behind thick, cloudy glass, a bejeweled urn said to contain the true ashes of the absconded and unnamed young disciple of Jesus. The shrines themselves were drenched in generations of candle wax and dry flowers and memorial cards for the beloved dead. "Front of the line, here you go," the tour guide said. He was shushed by the jute monk managing the line on the far side of the holy seat. The black monk standing near Prin shushed back his counterpart, who squared up and glared. The monks gestured back and forth at their chests and crosses and lineups, and then the jute monk pointed violently at the young man in front of Prin, who was thin and troubled-looking. His hands held forth in supplication. He was approaching the holy seat on his knees, very slowly. The jute monk crossed to the black monk's side and pushed the young man's shoulder to get and hurry up, because the next pilgrim, the jute monk's pilgrim, needed to have his turn. The black monk didn't like this at all. Lachad han daruna. Lo, lachad han daruna. Khadab al-mejaf. They bumped back and forth, chest to chest, umpire and manager, crosses clinking like nails being hammered while they accused each other of lies and deceits that went back hours and days and centuries. The whole time, the young man kept inching along on his knees. Prin saw the next man in line on the jute side whisper to his buddy. He was a lone young man in white patterned shorts and a LeBron James jersey. Prin saw him take a long steel cylinder out from behind him. Oh God, a rifle! Oh no, a selfie stick. He stole ahead and sat down in the holy seat. He struck a man-spreading pose that revealed the pattern on his shorts was actually a blonde woman in a bikini who stretched across his hips. He held the selfie stick in front of him, grinned, and snapped away. The monk stopped fighting and together chased the young man off the holy seat and out of the church. The young man's friend followed after them, laughing and recording it all with his phone. With the monk gone, the tour guide took Prin by the arm, stepped over the kneeling man still making his way forward, and pushed him towards the holy seat, where Prin got down on his knees. Not knowing what else to do, and really not liking the theological implications of kissing this particular piece of sacred space, he placed a hand on the smooth, slight indenture in the stone and almost demanded to know why God had told him to come here and then gone silent. Instead, he prayed that he be given the courage and grace never to run away from God again. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take some questions either about the kind of first half of the talk, which had to do with Marilynne Robinson and Flannery Oconnor, or the second half, which was from the reading. And then I also say, mindful of their students here, if you just want to talk a little bit more about the writing life, I'd be happy to do that as well. Well, I think maybe my point is that I'm not, it's not Robinson that I'm critiquing, it's Robinson's reception that I'm critiquing. That she is kind of held up in these kind of, I think, extraordinary ways. She's a brilliant writer. I love reading her, I love teaching her, I love writing about her. She's great. But her success says more, I think, about the terms for how we're willing to admit a religiously serious Christian writer into contemporary book culture. So Robinson herself, again, like I think I tried to say in the talk, I'm not asking her to write about God with an iPhone or something, right? There's nothing like that, but it's just, I think she is, part of her success, beyond again her brilliance, is the fact that she doesn't really, she doesn't challenge the contemporary first world secular-minded reader who can kind of just see this sort of beautiful, wistful memory of a religious time in her work. The way, again, I think many readers respond to post-colonial and indigenous writing. It doesn't implicate me, so therefore I can be fully appreciative of it. But Robinson would share a lot of the foundations of her readership, even if they wouldn't acknowledge it themselves. Housekeeping is a different work altogether, a beautiful and brilliant novel where I think, especially gender, I think, figures, gender and community, women's community, kind of changes, I think, a lot of how religious experience figures in that book.
Do you see the art and already?
Well, I think what's interesting about O'Connor is she seems to have perfect currency on both sides of that, right? That people can talk about O'Connor as a Cold War writer just as much as they can talk about sacramental imagination in O'Connor's work. I'm not sure yet. I think it's too early to know how people will be reading Marilynne Robinson in 25 years, right? And whether she has a strong environmental politics, among other things, how much that'll figure in future readings of her. But I think O'Connor's fully in that kind of both-and spot now. It's things like this. So I would have been sitting right where you were a few years ago at a talk at a historically Christian college, and this podium had a big, beautiful crest of some kind on it that had been pried off, probably because it was too religious seeming, but they hadn't sort of sanded it, and so it was just sort of, it was so strikingly bare. So I'm just listening to a talk, and the entire time I was kind of fixated on this clear, bare crest around, and they hadn't found anything else, is what I found kind of telling. They ripped it off because this isn't acceptable anymore. This thing has, a cross on it and Mary and all this stuff. But we've got nothing else to put there. So it'll just be this bare, flat, kind of stark self-representation. And I was just sitting there, and I started thinking about for some reason, giving a talk at a place where that would be thank God that's not the case here, where that would be the case, right? Where you would just sort of, and then that combined with being in Milwaukee for Christmas, my wife's from Milwaukee, and I was watching the news, and a local guy from rural Wisconsin had gone off to the Middle East to fight the terrorists on his own. Some kind of entrepreneurial, mercenary, well-meaning kind of oafish guy. And I was thinking, why would he do that? That seems crazy. Why would he do? And then you put those. Suddenly, things just start to kind of pop together when you're a writer, right? So those two things together started kind of cooking up, and suddenly it turns into a campus novel set in the Middle East. I find science fiction a place where I think a coherent and full cosmology with some kind of openness to a creator is far more legible and acceptable. The novel that immediately comes to mind is not by a Catholic, but by, I think he's Australian, the writer Michel Faber. And it was, what's that book called? The Book of Strange New Things?
Oh, yes, the Book of Strange. Yes, that's very good. That actually, yes, that's not explicitly Catholic, but it is very Christian.
Well, it's very Christian, and it's basically about this well-meaning kind of recovering alcoholic lefty minister who, in a near future, signs up for a space expedition with this corporation that's basically mining a different country, a different planet's resources. And the problem is that the aliens who live there want to learn about Jesus. And so the corporation goes, sure, great, we'll get you a minister. And then things play out, and you can imagine all the different ways that this plays out. But the really interesting question is, later in the book, there's this whole argument. There's the minister who believes, there's all the people he worked with who could care less and kind of make fun of him for it and are skeptical. But they all come from, they're all formed a certain way to some degree. So he's really struggling because he can't explain the concept of sin to the aliens. So then, one of these kind of guys in the cafeteria just says, well, how can they be Christian if they don't understand sin? And it leads to this really interesting conversation. And science fiction allows for that, I think, in a lot of ways. Part of the reason why I like to write a lot of book reviews, for instance, is it's just a way to kind of make sense of what's going on out there in literary culture, and then also engage it out of my own interests. Years ago, I read, actually at Boston University, a book called Grammars of Creation by George Steiner. And he makes mention in this book of what he calls a core tiredness setting into late Western culture. That no longer, as a word, is kind of the mainstream intellectual cultural elite, either they don't even care about Christianity anymore. They're not arguing with the Judeo-Christian tradition at all. They're kind of just tired, right? It's just trying to find other things. And that phrase stuck with me for some reason. Core tiredness. Where do we see core tiredness? How does that play out? So how do we see core tiredness? The higher order popularity of someone like Marilynne Robinson. So again, beyond the brilliance, which I always want to make clear, I acknowledge, you're tired, so you still long for it somehow, or The Road. Cormac McCarthy's The Road. So where I might teach that rather than review it, right? So I find all these different modes, but the beauty of being a novelist is you're sitting there and you just see the bare crest and you think, your head starts going a little bit, right? And so that's one place where I can kind of explore things in some ways with greater freedom, but only a certain amount of freedom because you're still governed by certain rules when you're a novelist. Yeah, so what I often do, I'll do this in the fall when I go off to literary festivals and things. I usually get up and I say, good evening, my name is Randy Boyagoda. I write critically acclaimed fiction that sells poorly. And then I explain it. The idea of a broad audience for any book these days is a wonderful thing, but for kind of serious literary fiction, I think it's a hard go, to be honest. And so, writing a more popular work, I think I tried to do something once, and an editor pointed out to me, that's just not what you're doing. That's not, you kind of tell, right? A boy wizard shouldn't show up in the middle of what I was just reading. Or werewolves or something. It doesn't make sense. And so you have to kind of write very naturally out of what makes sense vocationally, intellectually, in terms of capacity. The good news that I have, I think, is that I have a good day job, which means that I can provide for my family and kind of take risks like this in writing without having to worry about some of the pressures that I think some of my other fellow writers would have to engage a larger audience in some ways. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.